What's up guys, ATCG here, welcome back to Yugioh Deck of the Day. Today we have another one of those decks that got a huge buff from the previous ban list. We covered the most wanted Sky Striker deck that it got through with Anchor's back, and now we're going to cover one of the old school favorite decks that a lot of people were just hoping that it finally would come back to full power. And Domain Monarch at last has all of its pieces back. Stormforth went back to 3, Aether had come back to 3-2, and now Pantheism is back to 3 as well, and the deck is exactly how it was back in its prime in 2016, where it took the meta by storm. So we're going to see exactly how the deck is functioning in today's meta. It's probably not as strong as it used to be, of course, but the deck is still very fun deck to play, and in certain matchups it can insta-win by just using the notorious win condition that the deck has. So before we begin, if you guys enjoy this video, don't forget to give it a like, it helps us a lot. Subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss the upcoming deck profiles that we're going to cover with the updated ban list. And now, let's get to the deck profile. So to start off with the Monarchs, who play 3 Aether, the Heavenly Monarch. This card is by far the best monster in the deck because it's a disruption of the deck. Not only does it get you a monster from the deck on summon, but it also, during your opponent's turn, is able to tribute summon itself onto the field to not only get a monster from your deck that can potentially disrupt your opponent, but also if you use the card like Stormforth, which is a quick play, you can just tribute your opponent's monsters and disrupt them this way. So you always want to have one copy of Aether from your hand, and if you are forced to use her in turn 1, that's perfectly fine, because you can special summon another copy from your deck, and during the end phase, that second copy will go back to your hand, so you can use her effect during your opponent's turn. So just make sure that you use one whenever you can to set up your grave, so you can have a spell or trap in the grave to banish for its effect during your opponent's turn, and it also gets you going by just sending the appropriate cards to the graveyard. 3 copies of Erebus. This card is not the optimal play going first, because unless you have a Return of the Monarchs, then you will not be able to search Aether, but if you don't have anything else, it's also a good card because it can snipe a random card of your opponent's hand. Its effect is non-targeting, which is relevant till this day because cards like Dragoon exist, so you need to have an out for this. So if you chain block this with a card like Yugioh, then you can just get rid of Dragoon very easily without your opponent being able to negate your Erebus. And it also has a secondary effect that if it's in the graveyard, you can discard a Monarch spell and trap and target a Monarch in your graveyard, not to your hand, which makes it very, very good for the grind game. So this deck can grind a lot as long as it has spells and traps in the deck to send for these two's effect, so you can just keep using their effects over and over again. So Aether and Erebus are the heart and soul of the deck. These two monsters that are ones that you're going to bring out consistently, and these are the ones that are going to win you the game. Now there are some utility one-offs that I play in the deck that I think are quite necessary, just because they're all searchable in their own way, so you just need them for certain matchups. The first one is Thestalos. People complain about a card like Smoke Grenade in Infernobles right now, but they're forgetting that Monarchs have something very similar too. Thestalos can just, when you tribute summon it, you reveal your opponent's entire hand, you send a card from the hand to the grave, and if it's a monster, they also take burn damage, so Thestalos is really good for winning in time if that comes up, and it does come up a lot if you plan to play this deck in a competitive event, because it's a very grindy deck that you're going to get into time very, very often, especially if you're up against another grind deck like Subterrors or Altergeist. So Thestalos is a really good card. It's searchable. You can use Escalation to summon it during your opponent's turn, just to make sure that the 6th card they drew is not something that would be the blowout, so you can just make sure they don't have anything that will destroy you. It's a really good card. The only downside is that it doesn't send any spells and traps on the deck to the grave, so it's not as good of a starter as Aether and Erebus are, because it doesn't send your Prime to the grave, it doesn't send your Pantheism to the grave, but still it is a really, really good card. And when your opponent doesn't have a very strong hand, maybe this one particular card is enough to make their whole hand a complete brick. 1 Kuraz, just 1. I think if you use it once, it's good enough. Back in the day, I think you were playing like 2 or 3 because you would have to use it over and over again for the mirror, but you're not going to see any mirrors very often these days. But just having this 1 Kuraz to summon from the deck with your Aether is really good because you can just pop cards. If your opponent has an important normal summon and you have to pop, even if they draw cards afterwards, then it doesn't matter. And sometimes you can just pop your own cards to get some deeper into your deck and also get another search with your Return of the Monarchs. 1 Magus' Fiend. This card is better in this deck than Vanity's Fiend, at least in the main deck, just because it's a searchable one. It has the appropriate stats to be able to search with your Return of the Monarchs because it has 1000 defense. So if you search this and you have the extra normal summon with like your Eidos or your Mithra, then you can just slam it onto the field, and this kills combo decks. If you're playing something against like Infernoble Knights or maybe a Dinosaurs, unless they have a card like Dark Ruler no more, they will not be able to play around this. If they have their appropriate hand for any combo, that they just use so many monsters in the deck that they will not be able to play anything. Dragon Link is another example. This deck cannot do anything unless it uses its monster effects. And the last monster that I'm playing is Pseudo Monarch. It's not exactly a Monarch, but I really like this card in the deck. Is 1 copy of Dark Simorgh. When you first look at this card, its stats are a bit weird, but then when you read Aether, you can just see that you can summon this from the deck with Aether because it has more than 2400 attack and it has exactly 1000 defense. You cannot summon this properly in the deck, but just summoning with Aether, having an option against decks like Altergeist and Subterror, it's completely broken, because when you summon this from the deck, deck, your opponent will not be able to set any cards for the turn. So if they start something like with a Hidden City, or maybe a Marionette or a Pot of Extravagance, they will not be able to set any of their back row in the hand, and these decks cannot do anything to interrupt you unless they have those back row cards. So you basically win a turn back, and because it's Monarchs, it's very easy to get 2 more Monarchs on the field during the following turn, so you can have the classic total of 4800 damage on the field, just OTK your opponent with that, or you can just properly tribute summon Darkseid Morg again during the next turn, because Aether will bounce it back to your hand during the end phase, so you can just completely lock them, and unless they find a card like Melusik, then they will not be able to play their game, because they're playing decks that rely on their 5 set cards very, very often. Now for the Squires, play 3 Idia. Idia is the best normal summon. You just get your Eidos from the deck, and then if it's into the grave, you can add one of your banished Monarch spells and traps, so you can have a good recovery. Usually you're going to be searching back your Pantheism in the early game, and during the late game, getting Stormforce is probably the best play, because you can just get rid of your opponent's monsters and try to push for game. 2 Eidos. This is not a 3-off, because it's not the card you want to see, because if you see this, it has to be with a card like Domain or a Tenacity to search Domain to lower the levels of one of your Monarchs, so you can summon the Monarch with just 1 tribute. So this is why you want to get this from your deck with Idia, but it also has a grave effect that you can banish it, to special summon an Idia from the grave, so you can get another Eidos from the deck and get plays going. This deck, once it gets going, it's very, very hard to stop. The problem is for it to get going, because it has a lot of ways to brick itself. 3 Mithra. I really like this card because it's a card that stacks with Eidos. You can get 2 monsters on the field, you can summon to the field both an Erebus and a Thessalos on the exact same turn, so that's really, really good. And if you give the token to maybe a deck like Burning Abyss, then unless they switch it to attack mode and crush it, then they won't be able to play, and we're going to see a lot more decks like Burning Abyss and Picky Fire now because of the ban list as well. So I think Mithra is a really good card to play in the deck right now, and it's also another way to get more tribute fodder on the field. Now let's go to the spells. 3 Pantheism of the Monarchs. Finally, the last piece of the puzzle has been complete. This card stayed at 1 for so long, it didn't need to. The deck is not what it used to be, but now a lot of people can rejoice. This card is back at 3, and the deck has most of its consistency back, because this card was the way that the deck had ways to get to draw the necessary pieces to be able to play. Because this card, not only does it get you a draw 2, it sends your Prime to the grave, which is another tribute fodder from the grave, and it also searches your card. This card does everything for the deck, and you can recycle it with Idia as much as you want with this deck, so it's really, really good. You can search this with Tenacity, so you can have many ways to get access to it, and now finally the deck can brick a lot less than before, because it has 3 copies. 3 Tenacity, great again. You just reveal one of your Monarchs, you search any spell or trap from your deck. Usually you go for Pantheism, but if you have it, then you can just search your Domain to lock your opponent, or a Stormforce if you're going second to try to break your opponent's board. Really, really good. And it's key to play 3 copies of all those spell cards, just because you can search them with Pantheism, because Pantheism's effect has not a random effect that your opponent can pick and choose which one they will give to you. So if you reveal 2 copies of one card and 1 copy of another card, if you wanted the 2 copies, then that's unfortunate, because your opponent will just give you the other card. But if you reveal 3 copies, then they have no choice but to give you that card. So this is why important to max out on these spell cards. 3 Stormforth. Not only is this card really good going second, but it's also a disruption with Aether, because you can just use this during your opponent's turn, because like I said, it's a quick play, so you can just use Aether's effect to tribute one of your own monsters and tribute one of your opponent's monsters, and that's 1 interruption, and then you can use Aether to get to Kuraz, and that's another interruption, and that's assuming you don't have Domain on the field, so your opponent will be able to play. Also, if you have a Return of the Monarchs on the field, then you can just use this to get a search during your own turn, and then you can get search during your opponent's turn, so you can keep the engine going. 3 Return of the Monarchs, again, another card that you have to max out because of Pantheism. Whenever you tribute summon any monster, you can just search a Monarch or your Majesty's Fiend if you want to lock your opponent this way, so it's another really good card, and it's a effect that locks you from the extra deck. Again, a lot of cards have this restriction, but if you're playing Domain Monarch, then it doesn't matter at all. And the last Monarch spell and trap for actually the Monarch spell is 3 Domain, because it's the name of the deck. The deck is called Domain Monarch for a reason. This is its main win condition. If you have a tribute summon monster, then your opponent cannot summon from the extra deck, and it also boosts your monsters when they attack, and it has the good effect to reduce the levels of a Monarch in your hand by 2. So even if you draw Eidos, if you have a way to search your Domain, then you can just summon your Aether or your Erebus with just 1 tribute, so you can go off this way. And for the generic spells, I play 1 Rhoda, because of course this searches your Idia. 1 for 1, this gets Idia from the deck, and if you summon Idia aside from normal summoning and use 1 for 1, and then even if you don't have Mithra, you can tribute summon twice, because you have not used your regular normal summon. 1 Foolish Burial. This card has 2 purposes. It acts as a Monarch just because of Erebus's effect. You can just send an Erebus and then send one of your spells and traps from your hand to the grave and get your Erebus back. Or you can send your Idia to the grave to get any of your banished spells and traps to your hand, so I think this card has really good utility in this deck. And 1 Upstart Goblin, because this deck needs all the consistency it can get, cannot run cards like Desires, so just Upstart is good enough. And for the traps, play 2 Prime Monarch. It's very tempting to run 3, just because Pantheism is at 3, but you're not going to see Pantheism every single time during the first opening hand, because I have all the memories from when I used to play the deck back in the day. Even with 3 Pantheism, it's not very, very consistent, opponents, so just playing 2 is good enough, so you make sure you don't brick with cards like you can't use just like the Prime Monarch. Prime Monarch is a good card that you can use for the grind game if you know that you're going to get into a grindy matchup. It has a good field effect as well that people sometimes forget, that you can shuffle back 2 Monarch spells and traps from your grave to the deck and draw 1 card during each turn. So just having 1 in the grave and 1 on the field, then you can make sure that you have resources for the late stages of the game, because unless you have Monarch spells and traps in your deck, then your Monarchs are not able to function properly. And the last card is Escalation, because with cards like Return, you can search your Thestalos, and then during your opponent's turn, you can summon Thestalos and look at your opponent's hand and rip a card. So this is a card I think that also provides really good utility for the deck, and all of these cards are searchable, so it's really good. It's a card that you don't have to max out, because it's not something you want to search with your Pantheism, because it doesn't give you any good thing to do during your turn. It's something that you want to search with your Tenacity if you need it to be able to do that play with, I said, with Thestalos or Erebus, of course. So yep, that's the deck, guys. It's really fun. I know a lot of people like this deck, and we're hoping that Pantheism will finally come back at 3, and now that it did, I'm hoping to see this deck see some love. I know it's not going to be a very good meta contender, but it's a deck that under the right circumstances, it can win games very, very easily, and this is the fun part about it, that your opponent, if they're not prepared for it, then they will not be able to do anything to counter it. So yep, guys, please, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. It helps us a lot with the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe to the channel, because we're going to update a lot more decks with ban lists and upcoming sets, of course, and we'll see you next time.